The 2022 midterm elections are now history here in the United States, and while some votes are still being counted and the final result is not known as of the time I'm shooting this, it appears likely that the Democrats will retain their majority in the U.S. Senate and lose their majority in the U.S. House, but just barely. Things could have been a lot worse. There was no red wave. Glory hallelujah, I guess. One of the reasons things went better than expected for us Democrats is that young voters turned out in big numbers and overwhelmingly supported the Democratic candidates over their Republican opponents. Thank you, Gen Z. Young voters are not a constituency that either major political party typically spends a lot of time or money courting, and when the subject comes up, the explanation is usually that young people aren't a reliable voting bloc because they don't vote. Which makes sense at first. Why would political parties invest resources in trying to win the votes of people who don't vote? But I was thinking about this the other day, and another question occurred to me. Why don't young people vote? Some of you probably recognize the name Abraham Wald. Even if you don't, I'm guessing a lot of you know his story. Abraham Wald was a mathematician who worked with the U.S. government's Statistical Research Group during World War II. He's the guy who figured out that the most efficient way to protect American planes from being shot down by enemy fire was to concentrate armor on areas of the plane that weren't being hit by bullets. It sounds counterintuitive. Why wouldn't you increase the armor on the parts of the planes that were covered in bullet holes? But Wald provided a simple but crucial insight. The planes they were studying were the ones that had flown into battle and returned. That meant the damage they observed was survivable. Wald reasoned that the planes which had been shot down had been damaged in areas where the surviving planes hadn't been. For example, the planes Wald and his colleagues were able to observe showed few hits to the engines. That didn't mean planes weren't being hit in the engines. It meant planes that were hit in the engines weren't making it back. So the best places to concentrate armor on planes were the areas where the bullet holes weren't. My purpose in reminding you of this story is to set myself up to ask yet another question. If we can figure out a good answer to why there don't seem to be many voters among younger people, wouldn't it be worth it to the Democrats to reach out more to young people, especially since, as we saw this year, when they do vote, they tend to favor Democrats by a significant margin? Isn't it possible that the Democrats could attract more voters to support them by going to where historically the voters aren't? Okay, that was two questions, but you get what I'm saying. The first step in deciding if this is a strategy worth pursuing is figuring out what compels young voters to vote when they do vote. Conventional wisdom in both major parties for decades has been that economic issues are the strongest factor influencing the choices of voters. Hence, Democratic strategist James Carville's immortal phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," which makes sense. Why wouldn't people care about the economy? But when voters under the age of 30 are surveyed, either before elections or in exit polls after they've cast their ballot, they indicate that they care about other issues. Issues like the environment and climate change, healthcare, addressing institutional racism, criminal justice reform, and immigration. This time around, 3 more issues seem to have made a difference to younger voters: President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, reproductive rights, and protecting democracy against election deniers, some of whom seemed to openly promise to cheat if necessary to hold on to power if elected. The Democratic Party leaned into those second two pretty hard. "We're not the Republicans" was basically their unofficial campaign slogan this time, as it was in 2020 and 2016. And it's effective, obviously, if somewhat lacking in substance. And maybe that's another bit of conventional wisdom that needs to be revisited, especially where it concerns the youth vote. The idea that voters aren't attracted to substance. They don't care about policy, so it is said. And that's obviously the case for some voters. Republicans evidently don't care about anything other than making life miserable for people who aren't them, which does require the enactment of certain policies, but the voters seem happy to leave the specifics to the politicians. But some voters, particularly younger voters, do seem interested in policy. Polling conducted before and after the election suggests that Biden's student loan forgiveness plan made a difference. Democrats' pledges to codify the right to obtain an abortion in the aftermath of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade also seems to have been a significant motivator, driving young voters to the polls. What drives young voters to the polls? Promising to enact specific policies that will benefit them or address problems they care about. So weird, right? And the thing is, reaching out to younger voters by focusing on specific policies related to issues they care about doesn't have to mean alienating the older voters, which the Democratic Party considers its more reliable base. If those voters really do care mostly about the economy, guess what? Most of the issues that seem of special concern to young voters are economic issues. Healthcare, the high cost of paying for care or maintaining insurance coverage is what makes healthcare inaccessible to many people, and medical bills account for a huge portion of the debt Americans are saddled with. An unexpected medical crisis can financially ruin a family. Making healthcare affordable, ideally through a true universal healthcare system that guarantees publicly funded care to everyone, would lift a crushing economic burden from millions of people in this country today and in generations to come. Criminal justice reform, racially biased policing and sentencing guidelines that disproportionately affect the poor and people of color can trap people arrested for minor offenses in a cycle of poverty and incarceration that can last the rest of their lives. Specific policies like doing away with cash bail and reforming civil forfeiture, which allows police to seize assets they suspect may have been involved in a crime, would make it easier for people to escape that cycle, a cycle which not only robs them of their freedom, but also of their ability to attain financial stability. Student loan debt relief. The Biden plan, if allowed to actually go through, it's currently being blocked in the courts by a Trump-appointed judge, would reduce the student loan debt of 43 million people and totally wipe out the student loan debt of 20 million. And Biden's plan was criticized by progressives for not going far enough. If a comparatively tentative student debt cancellation program could have that kind of effect, imagine how economically liberating it would be to cancel all federally held student debt and to further reform the student loan system, or better yet, make publicly funded colleges and universities tuition-free to prevent student loan debt from becoming a problem again in the future. All of these issues, and more that I haven't even mentioned, such as making it easier for workers to unionize or raising the federal minimum wage, preferably to a living wage, are economic issues. They're things most Democrats, regardless of age, already support, and they are of particular importance to young voters. If it really is the economy stupid, doesn't it make sense to campaign on economic issues in a way that will not only appeal to people who are already reliable voters, but also energize a potentially massive block of new voters? The midterms were not the dominant Republican victory many of us feared, which is great news, but the results were still frustratingly close, especially given that the choice was between a party that wants to continue to undermine democracy and strip people of their rights, and a party that wants to not do that. Feels like that race really shouldn't have come down to a photo finish, doesn't it? The fact that it did is not entirely the fault of the Democratic Party. Republicans have given themselves unfair advantages whenever and wherever possible, relying on partisan redistricting and state and local election laws that suppress turnout from reliably Democratic demographics to tip the scales in their favor before a single vote has even been cast. But that doesn't mean the Democrats are completely without responsibility here. If your opponents are openly campaigning on bigotry and fascism and you're just barely able to hold your own against them, you should probably have a look at why more people aren't more enthusiastic about voting for you. Turnout among people ages 18 to 29 was the second highest in 30 years for a midterm election, but it was still only a little over 25%. If that 25% was the difference in the Democrats holding the line this time, imagine the impact if we could increase that number. Actually, we don't have to imagine the impact. Young voter turnout in the previous midterm election, 2018, was over 30%. And Democrats won control of the House of Representatives. Young voter turnout in the last presidential election, 2020, which the Democrat won, was around 51%, 8 points higher than the 2016 presidential election, which, I'm sure I don't need to remind you, the Democrat lost. Although, she did win the nationwide popular vote, as has the Democratic candidate in every presidential election but one since 1992. Not the point of this video. I'm just saying, turnout is more important to winning elections than ever. Republicans rely on gerrymandering and suppressing the vote in order to win, and the only way to defeat that strategy is to overwhelm it through sheer numbers. When we show up, we win. When we don't, we don't. That being the case, the Democratic Party needs to be looking to expand its core base of reliable voters wherever possible, and one of the most obvious places is the youth vote. Americans under the age of 30 are more tolerant, more socially conscious, and more progressive than their parents and grandparents. They can help Democrats win locally and nationally, election after election, and end this infuriating and demoralizing one step forward, two steps back pattern that has stifled real progress as the Democrats and the Republicans trade power back and forth every few elections. For that to happen, the Democratic Party needs to stop ignoring or dismissing younger voters and start doing the work that many progressive organizers have been doing all along, listening to young Americans, taking their concerns seriously, and giving them something to vote for. Go to where the voters aren't, and we might find that they've actually been there all along. We just haven't been seeing them.